It's amazing to see that many people are here to see me present. So for those in the US, I know it's very early, it's 8 a.m. Thank you very much for attending. And for those in Indonesia, I know my friends and family are here, so thank you very much for staying up. The presentation that I'm going to deliver today is titled Of Terms and God, Vaccine Refusal Among Indonesian Muslims and the Shifting Authority of the MUI's Fatwas. I want to start this presentation by talking about the MUI's religious ethics, or also called fatwas, on public health issues. In 1983, the Indonesian Council of Islamic Scholars, or also what I would call the MUI throughout this presentation, issued a fatwa about family planning, which was a state program back then. This fatwa supports the use of several contraceptive methods among Muslims, such as the intrauterine devices and vasectomy. This fatwa was a successful one, considering the increase of the use of contraceptive methods among Indonesians after the issuance of the fatwa. Although this success should not be credited to the fatwa alone, this fatwa is still a success. Decades later, in 2018, the MUI issued another fatwa on public health, this time specifically on the use of measles rubella vaccine. This fatwa was issued as a response to the Indonesian Muslims' refusal to take part in the state's mass vaccination program, mainly because they believe that in this vaccine, it contains Islamically impure or haram substances like pig enzymes, for example. The MUI fatwa says that although some vaccines are indeed haram, they're indeed impure, but they are permitted to be used by Muslims under emergency situations, such as, for example, if the disease is very deadly and there is no halal or pure vaccine invented yet in the country. But here's the interesting thing. Instead of gaining success like the 1983 fatwa, this fatwa, the 2018 one, was not obeyed by Indonesian Muslims completely. Many vaccine-skeptical Muslims in the country did follow the MUI's decision that this vaccine is impure, but at the same time, they refused to follow the MUI's decision that this vaccine is permissible or allowed to be used. And this has made the measles rubella vaccination rate to plummet in the country. This phenomenon makes me wonder, why don't these Muslims trust the vaccination fatwa issued by the MUI? What could possibly explain these Indonesian Muslims' disobedience to the MUI's fatwa, especially on public health and vaccination? In this preliminary research, I argue that this could happen because MUI's legitimacy as a religious authority is being undermined in the country, especially in public health issues. This undermining is caused, among others, by the state's move toward democratization in the late 20th century, but it is also caused by non-state factors, such as the growth of scripturalism in Quranic interpretation, the Islamization of science, and also the spread of new media such as the internet or the social media in Indonesia. As a preliminary research of a hopefully bigger research project, I used literature review and online data collection as my research methods. Before going further into discussing the MUI and its authority, I would like to explain to you why I think this research is significant or important. I see this research important because first, it studies religious authority not only from the top, but also by paying attention to the receiving end of it. This research sees how people also actively engage in receiving the authority instead of just sitting there being subjects that passively obey. Secondly, many studies covering the MUI and its fatwas focus mainly on the MUI's power to gain followers or to be followed. Very few scholars actually talk about how the MUI and the MUI fatwas can also be not followed or can be challenged by its followers. Lastly, this research also highlights the importance of public health issues in the discussion of the MUI. The study of the MUI has so far focused on topics such as politics or religious morality or religious violence, and very little attention has actually been paid to the relationship between the MUI and the public health issues, despite the fact that public health has been an issue that the MUI paid attention for so long, since its early days. In order to understand the MUI's authority better, I would like to explain to you what the MUI is, how it works, and what kind of people are in there. So the MUI is a non-governmental council of of Islamic scholars, or also called ulama, that is established in 1975 under a regime called the New Order regime. For those who are not familiar with this regime, a New Order regime is an authoritarian regime characterized by the repression of state opposition. This regime, for example, tried to limit the movements of many Islamic organizations to keep the state stability. One of them by creating the MUI as a forum to silence religious dissent. This regime lasted in Indonesia for approximately 30 years, from the 60s to the 90s. The MUI is one of the biggest Islamic organizations in Indonesia, and is represented by scholars from both traditionalist and modernist Islamic streams. As an Islamic organization, the MUI's role is purely advisory, meaning that it's prohibited from launching practical programs such as building schools or like building hospitals. And one of its most important religious ethics or religious advices is in the form of fatwa. A fatwa can cover a broad range of topics, from something as personal as prayer or ritual or family matters to something societal like terrorism, or the topic that I'm focusing on in this presentation, public health and vaccination. A fatwa itself is ideally non-binding, meaning that Muslims in an ideal situation can choose to follow it or not. But as for the MUI's case, fatwas are usually followed by most Indonesian Muslims because the MUI, for example, represents a broad range of Islamic stream in Indonesia. It has been long established in the country, and also it is close to the government. It is very common for the government to refer to the MUI when they're talking about religious issues, for example. In the next slide, I will provide two cases of vaccination fatwas. The first is meningitis vaccine fatwa, and the second is measles rubella vaccine fatwa. The reasons why I chose these two fatwas is because of the controversy they stirred among Indonesian Muslims, which to me personally reflect perfectly the nature of the MUI's fatwa in the 21st century Indonesia. Another reason why I chose these two fatwas is because they were widely covered by the media, making it easy for me to access or collect data about them. Meningitis is a disease that causes serious infection on the brain linings. The spread of meningitis disease is facilitated through large gatherings such as Scout Jamboree or religious pilgrimage such as Hajj for Muslims. This is why in 2002, the government of Saudi Arabia made this vaccination obligatory for every single person who wants to go to a pilgrimage to Mecca. However, in April 2009, a controversy about the Islamic purity of this vaccine surfaced in Indonesia, following a research stating that this vaccine was not pure, was haram. This made many would-be pilgrims from Indonesia hesitant to get vaccinated. As a response to that halal controversy, the MUI issued a fatwa regarding the meningitis vaccine. After testing the vaccine in their laboratory, the MUI finally decided that the vaccine was haram, but nonetheless allowed for Muslims to use because meningitis is deadly and there was no halal substitutes to that vaccine. But still, after the issuance of that fatwa, many Muslims still would not want to get vaccinated. Some even canceled their pilgrimage plan just because they did not want to get vaccinated with a haram vaccine. It is only in 2010 that two new vaccine brands arrived in Indonesia. The MUI soon issued a new fatwa regarding meningitis vaccine, deciding that the two new brands are halal. This fatwa automatically annulled or canceled the previous fatwa in 2009, deciding that the old vaccine are now haram and prohibited. A similar case happened recently with different kind of vaccine. In 2017 and 2018, the Indonesian government ran a mass vaccination campaign against measles and rubella. This campaign was a response to the drop of vaccination rate among Indonesian children. This campaign, however, ran into a widespread refusal, especially from Muslims from outside of Java Islands. The reason why they refused this vaccination is not unfamiliar at all. Many believe that the measles rubella vaccine is impure or haram. As a response to the refusal, the MUI issued a fatwa in 2018, deciding that the vaccine is haram or impure, but nonetheless allowed to be used. The reason of this permissibility of vaccine is emergency conditions. The fatwa, for example, cites health experts saying that measles and rubella are deadly diseases, and there are no halal vaccines invented yet. Ironically, the issuance of this fatwa has caused the measles rubella immunization rate to plummet. The MUI's fatwa decision that the vaccine is haram received more attention by many Muslims than its decision that the vaccine is permissible. For example, the vaccination coverage in islands outside of Java has reached only 68% from the targeted 95% by the end of this mass vaccination program. In some regions, it was even worse, only 8% in Aceh, a province ruled by Sharia law. So what causes these Muslims' refusal to follow the MUI's fatwa in public health issues, especially on vaccination? My argument is that because the MUI's legitimacy as a religious authority is being undermined by several state and non-state factors. The first factor, which is coming from the state, is the shift to democratization in Indonesia in the beginning of the 21st century. Earlier in this presentation, I have mentioned how the MUI was established under this new order regime. And under this regime, the MUI was co-opted by the government, and it was used to legitimize the state's development programs through its fatwas or through its religious decisions. Also, during the new order regime, the government has tried to restrict the movement of several organized Islam. This restriction has given the MUI, which was close to the new order government, some sort of dominance over the Islamic discourse in the country. Therefore, the MUI's religious legitimacy during the new order was derived from the endorsement of the authoritarian government. After the downfall of the new order regime, Indonesia shifted from being under an authoritarian regime to a more democratic one. Islamic organizations have now become more assertive in voicing their opinions. Often they have become more conservative, something that is not possible or very highly impossible in the new order regime. This includes the MUI, which after the new order regime has so much more freedom in voicing their agenda. Nonetheless, the freedom from state cooptation comes with a price. According to Saad, the post-new order MUI has experienced some sort of authority undermining. First, because now the state is trying to curb the MUI's movement to religious realm only. Second, because the MUI now has to compete with other big Islamic organizations for authority, and these organizations range from the fundamentalist ones to the liberal ones. And the third, the internal conflict that is happening inside the MUI made people of the country question their credibility as a religious authority. In short, although the MUI has more freedom in deciding their direction today, their authority has also been undermined by the change of regime. Other than the state shift of regime, the reasons of the MUI's authority undermining also comes from non-state factors. The first non-state factors is the rising popularity of a more Puritan or scripturalist Quranic interpretation in Indonesia, especially in the 21st century. Some other might call this fundamentalist interpretation, but I refrain from using that term because of its political loadedness. This kind of interpretation is characterized with a return to the Quran and the return to the prophetic tradition as the most authentic source of Islamic law. In such interpretation, people draw a clear-cut divide between the words of God and the words of human. The Quran, for example, is seen as the words of God that is true and infallible, since it comes directly from the divine source, whereas interpretations of the Quran is something else. It is seen as the words of human, which is debatable and fallible because it does not come from the divine source itself. Going back to the vaccination fatwa and the reasons why people don't follow it, the reason why people follow the MUI's decision that some vaccines are impure or haram is because rules about which ones are halal, which ones are haram are clearly stated in the Quran. They are the words of God that is true and must be followed. Whereas the notions of urgency or emergency to using a haram vaccine are nowhere to be found in the Quran. It is a matter that needs human interpretation or the words of humans. This makes it fallible and secondary to the words of God. The second cause of the MUI's authority undermining is the rise of Islamization of science or knowledge. The rise of Islam in the 21st century Indonesia has also brought Islamic touch to science and knowledge. During this era, more Muslims have come to think that Quran and the ways of God are the sources of all knowledge and technology. Islamization of knowledge stems from the growing dissatisfaction of the current knowledge system that does not implement Islamic visions for some people. Such phenomenon also happens to medical science. Popular among Muslim communities today is the use of what's called prophetic medicine. This includes the use of some home remedies such as honey or cumin or date, believed to be exemplified by the Prophet as a way to cure diseases or boost immunity. Due to the existence of the so-called prophetic immunization method or prophetic medicine, many vaccine-skeptical Muslims think that the use of haram vaccine is nowhere near emergency. Such belief leads to their disagreement with the MUI's vaccination fatwas, especially with the decision that permits haram vaccines to be used in emergency situations. Finally, the democratization of media and the introduction to new media, such as the internet or the social media, played a big role in the undermining of the MUI's authority. During the New Order, all media outlets were being strictly controlled by the government. This also included media with Islamic contents that did not align with the government's idea of a good Islam. However, starting in the 1990s, the Indonesian television system was starting to get liberalized. Following the fall of the authoritarian New Order, press and radio, they have also gained more freedom, and this freedom includes the freedom to talk about Islam. This democratization of media has ultimately allowed Muslims to access more Islamic ideologies or more Islamic authorities previously restricted by the New Order government to circulate. Other than that, the introduction of new media, such as the internet, social media, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, has challenged the traditional religious authority in Indonesia. If the traditional religious authority is heavily top-down, or from an authority or an ulama to its followers, new media allows lay Muslims like me and you to participate in discussions about Islam and circulate their knowledge horizontally as opposed to vertically. In this research, finally, I have come to three conclusions. First, it is that the authority of the MUI in Indonesia, especially relating to public health issues concerning Muslims, is not stagnant. It is always shifting and it can be challenged. The cause of this authority undermining can come from state factors, for example, the regime shift, but it also comes from below, from the non-state factors, from the society, which leads to my third conclusion that it is a proof that Muslims in Indonesia are not passive receiver of fatwas. They actively engage in the creation of the MUI's authority in Indonesia. And finally, as an anthropologist to be, I allocate some space to talk about my reflection about this research. To me personally, this topic about the MUI's authority in public health is very timely and relevant, especially during the coronavirus 19 pandemic. In Indonesia, we have seen that the MUI has issued several fatwas regarding coronavirus. For example, MUI has issued this fatwa that regulates the social distancing during Islamic prayers, or the prohibition to do mudik or mass exodus following Islamic celebrations. However, they are mostly not followed by Indonesian Muslims. People still pray in congregations. People still go back to their hometowns. In future research, I think this study would help understand better the reason why many Muslims ignore the MUI's fatwas on public health issues, without necessarily generalizing these people as being uninformed or careless. Especially later, after the coronavirus vaccine has been invented, I think this research could help understand or navigate better the challenges that the MUI and the state could face ahead in the implementation of vaccination in this Muslim majority Indonesia. Thank you very much for attending my talk. If you have questions, if you have commentaries, you have suggestions, you can let me know later in the question and answer sessions. But for now, I will turn it over to Anuranjan Sethi, which is my respondent for this paper. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Amrina. It was a lovely presentation, and I really enjoyed reading your paper as well. So I just want to start with saying that I think the timeliness of your paper is also very good, given especially the debates around the availability of vaccine and the administration of vaccine at the universal level at which we are talking at this point globally. I think it's going to present some very complicated challenges, both for public policy as well as for lawmakers. And I think the paper helps us start thinking and reflecting in that direction. So I definitely think that, the timeless paper is amazing. A few comments that I have on the paper. First, I want to start with talking about the anthropological impact. I think it serves an important it contributes to the scholarship of fatwa, an area which is a well-developed area, but I think the ability to provide a granular account of how does a fatwa materialize on the ground, I think provides some useful inputs for thinking about the role of religion. Also in the lawmaking process, the rule of law processes in the post-colonial societies, where a law was essentially an imposed institution by the colonizers, and for it to become something more internalized, I think there are processes which are at play. And your paper, I think, gives us a very good example of how such a rule of law comes into play, how it achieves its authority in a society like Indonesia. That's one. I think fatwa is an interesting tool to think through for various reasons as well. I think it has shades of being the jurisprudential tool itself, a religious edict at one point, and also a public prescription. So form like fatwa, I think, presents interesting ways to think about institutions such as law, which are monolithic, and the state authority, which is also in the West understood a lot to be derived from constitutional bodies and the government and so on. So I think your paper helps us think about the complexity of those institutions outside of the context of the West. Also importantly, I would say that the paper also throws some light on the social processes of how does an instrumentality of state, such as a fatwa or a law, receive its authority? Is it only a top-down process, or is there a bottom-up as well at play? And like you mentioned in your presentation, there is a lot of multidimensional, multidirectional processes which tend to contribute to how an instrumentality of a state receives legitimacy and validity. I feel also that one of the important contributions of your paper is to break the image of the totalizing effect of religious Islamic institutions. So this is something which we see a lot happening in the non-Muslim world, where a word like fatwa is often understood as kind of a bond to catch a criminal, somebody who's committed a crime, especially in the Salman Rushdie context, which popularized the term fatwa in the non-Muslim world. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about understanding what a fatwa is, what role it plays in a societal constitution, etc. So I think your paper is a useful paper in also pushing the scholarship and the thinking in that direction. I also felt that the paper also contributes towards changing or questioning the popular perceptions of certain constructs like haram, halal, mubah. We receive them in a non-Muslim world as constructs which are very simplistically meaning as prohibited or allowed or permissible, though prohibited originally, but permissible like mubah is. But I think there is a textual complexity to these concepts which needs to be traced back to its sources in Quran and how practices have evolved to look at these these constructs. So I feel that the paper also is useful for breaking the simplistic understanding which the public or popular imagination often acquires of these essentially Islamic concepts. And therefore, it helps in, I think, declogging or clarifying the complex notions that they carry. Finally, I also want to talk about, I think there's interesting and important thoughts to be derived in terms of modernization of Islam. I think you talk about Islamization of course, state, and in countries like Indonesia, where the state is, is a religious state. So there's a lot of, again, thinking that such a states don't have non-secular processes at play in terms of their lawmaking, in terms of their social processes. So I think it's useful to get a sense of how non-secular processes have very much a part to play within the so-called religious societies, and the complexity and the granularity of it, I think, is presented in your paper as well. I personally, also being an outsider to anthropology, but now getting into anthropology, also think a lot about the questions of being a native anthropologist and how do you study the social to which you yourself belong. I think that's a challenging notion. We are struggling to understand how that has to be done. But I think your paper was good to read. It gave me also personally some ideas about, how do you deal with the very social that you belong to, and study it as objectively as possible. So that's good. Also, in terms of the Indonesian national identity, which is not a purely religiously formed identity, is something I think your paper engages with. I think it's useful to understand what other processes than the religious ones also contribute towards building a national identity. And this question is very much something that we are struggling with in other parts of the world. In India, I can speak of that as well. The Hindu identity is something that we are struggling to resist and needing to find other elements which can be used to claim the identity of India without necessarily it being a Hindu identity. So I think your paper also helps us in thinking about that. Your use of digital archives, Facebook, etc., I think is a good way to see how digital archives, etc., can be used for ethnographic research. Just a moment, looking through my notes. Yeah, and I think there's one last thing that I want to say is that I think your study of the way fatwa is employed in a social process such as vaccination, talking about Islamization of sciences and things like that, I think it's presenting the possibility of an alternative vision of modernity, from the one that we largely receive from the West. I think these alternative visions need to be paid more attention to. We need to think about how we can bring them into mainstream, to think more in a more grounded way about how are we receiving modernity, how are we constructing modernity while we are experiencing it as well. So I thought those are the few of my comments which I got from a paper there. It's very interesting. I'm sure the questions will also be equally appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation and Anu for the response. And I also want to just say a quick word of thanks to Professor Hirozaku Miyazaki, who was the Arryman, saying hello there, the Arryman mentor, who is the faculty member in anthropology who worked all year with Amrina on this terrific project. So thank you, Hiro, for that. And at this point, we're going to open it up now for your participation. And I will ask Beth Morrissey's assistance in doing this because there is some sort of hand-raising function that you are able to use. I don't see a hand, yeah, I don't see a hand-raising function on my screen.
That's because you're a host. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, raise your hand if you would like to make a comment or pose a question to Amrina. We'll take a couple questions and then we'll let Amrina respond. And then we'll do as many rounds as time permits. So the floor is open. And we have 2 participants raising hands. Let me see here. Yos and Sirojudin Arif. So how about if we do Yos first? Beth, can you open up Yos's microphone and video?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Yos.
Hi, Jeff. Hi, Amrina. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation, Amrina. I think it's a very good project. I love your presentation and the idea. And I think if you develop it further, it's going to be a great project for your graduate school career. I only have something like, so if we think a fatwa is like a policy, then in every policy, I think you need some sort of like threat or some sort of so basically what I mean in what is back in the New Order era, MUI was supported by the state, right? I mean, with all the state apparatus, including the military, to maybe to enforce or to disseminate the message of MUI fatwas. But do you see like, is there any like changing situation in which the MUI fatwa is being implemented after the fall of Suharto's? And if so, I'm thinking something like sometimes the fatwa could be what do you call it, like could be trustable or could have like some sort of credible threat to the fatwa. So for example, like I'm not talking about the vaccine per se, but I'm talking about the MUI fatwa on maybe voting for a Muslim leader in elections. So in that sense, there's some sort of like groups, societal groups that supports MUI fatwa, and it comes with a credible threat. Do you think this kind of threat is also makes sense in explaining what happens with the changing nature of MUI fatwas? Thank you, Amrina, and congratulations. Welcome to the club.
Okay, that's good first question. And we're going to go now to Sirojudin Arif. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you for Amrina Rosyada. First of all, I would like to thank you for your good presentation. You have very good question, and I think it's very timely now, especially if you see that the vaccine coverage in Indonesia declined during the last few years, and which is very bad news. And I think your paper could be greatly improved if you look at the regional variation. So you see that the vaccine coverage is not the same across the country. Between Java and outside Java, it's not the same. And if I am not mistaken, if you look at the Riscus dash, the result of Riscus dash, the 3 regions in which the coverage of vaccine declined very significantly is Aceh, Sumatra Barat, and Riau, right? And all of these regions are dominated by what we might call Puritan Islamic thinking. So I believe if you look at the variation and you link between this regional variation with, and I think we shouldn't, no. I think within the MUE, there is also differences, heterogeneity. So rather than single body, probably MUE is also not single body. It consists of many organizations with different religious views. So if you look at the region like Aceh, Riau, and Sumatra Barat, there are regional MUE figures. So despite the central MUE fatwa that yes, vaccine can be used because of the emergency, but if you look at in the regional level, some MUE figures, they still that they didn't necessarily follow the central fatwa. So it can be the case that rather than because of the fragmentation of the MUE fatwa, they don't believe, they refuse vaccine, or it can be just the opposite. Because of the fragmentation within the fatwa, they refuse the because within the MIE, there are differences. So some people within the region, they follow their own MUE. We didn't follow the central MUE. They refuse the fatwa. So if you look at the regional variation and you can trace whether it is true or no, it can be, I think the answer will be very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and address all 3, that is comments on Anu's response and then the 2 questioners.
Okay, thank you very much once again for the generous response from Anu. I don't think I have lots of things to say about Anu's response. He's being very generous about his response and everything, and there are some responses that I didn't think about before. So thank you very much for your insight on my paper. I hope I can improve better in that. And as for the comments from I'm sorry, what was the name? Is
Sirajuddin?
Mas Sirajuddin. Thank you very much also for the input. I actually have found that the MUI, the regional MUI, is also kind of fragmented in the way that sometimes they have like different opinions from the central MUI, but as far as I know is that sometimes they, after the central MUI issued a national fatwa, the usual trend is that the regional MUI kind of follows what the central MUI says, but I might be wrong. So thank you very much for your input about looking further into the fragmentation of authority within the MUI body itself. And as for Mas Yo's question, yeah, I think in some cases of fatwa, such as fatwas on heretical beliefs or aliran sesat in Indonesia, it is still very similar to what happens in the old order, in terms of the state still uses it as as a reason to enact some laws, and it's very backed up by the government as well. And there are also some fatwas that I'm sure is still very backed up by the government, other than the fatwa about aliran sesat or heretical beliefs, such as what you have said about the fatwa on choosing Muslim leaders, for example. But some fatwas, they really do not get as much attention as those fatwas in which the government have kind of an agenda related to that fatwa. For example, I've discovered that there's this fatwa about environmental conservation, for example. And it's very, I've never seen or heard any governmental body talk about that fatwa. Or maybe this fatwa about vaccination is also not so enforced by the government. So I think the answer as to why some fatwas are like very backed up by the government and some other are not, I think it might be because it's simply because some fatwas resonate to the government's agendas and some other just simply don't. So that would be my answer to your question. I hope it answers well.
Okay. All right. Any other hands to be raised at this point? Is that Bonnie? Hold on a second. We're going to turn on your microphone. Okay, Bonnie. Bonnie, are you asking a question? We can't hear you. You're muted, Bonnie. Can you turn on your microphone? Okay. We're having a problem with your sound, Bonnie. All right, well, while we're working out that sound issue, any others who would like to ask a question? All right. Sabina. Go ahead, Sabina.
Thanks, Jeff. Congratulations, Amrina. It's a really wonderful presentation and project you have there. Thank you very much. I'm curious to know if you have, imagination or like what are your plans going forward? I think it seems like this is a very timely and also interesting project, of course. What do you have in mind in the coming year ahead of you after you've joined the club? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question, Sabina. That's a good question, actually, because this is such an uncertain time. And you're very, as an anthropologist, where you usually go to the field and do field work, this is the time where you can't really do that. So I think one of the things that I realized from doing this research project is that I'm actually interested more in exploring the reasons why people refuse vaccination, or why people have interesting theories about some pandemics or some diseases, such as, for example, in Indonesia, many people say that, oh, coronavirus is a global elite conspiracy, or maybe many people think that, oh, vaccination is the Jewish conspiracy or some sort. So I think for now, my interest kind of lies in the relationship between those fears or those affective dimensions in relations to like body ethics or bioethics or something like that. So yeah, and maybe for now I'll just do a lot of readings because I can't really go to the field anyway. But thank you for that question. Makes me think about what I want to do, what I should do in the future.
Okay. If we don't have any other hands raised, we are coming up on the end of our available time. Last chance to jump in with a question if you have one. And oh, here we go. Ayu, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey.
Sure.
Hi, Amrina, and hi, everyone. Thank you, Amrina, for your amazing presentations. I really enjoyed your smooth talk. And actually, in your presentations, I really interested on the aspect of public trust to MUI. You have mentioned about how the organization was established before, which is a good point, I think. But I hope you can elaborate more how actually the image of MUI in Indonesian society, because I know that for example, in the case of halal certifications, a lot of people think that MUI is not Islamic organization anymore, but it's kind of a business organization. And don't you think it's also affect how people can trust this organization to give the fatwa? Thank you very much.
Quick comment, Amrina?
Okay, thank you very much, Ayu, for the question. I'm just gonna answer this real quick because we're running out of time, but what I want to say is that I cannot speak for all Indonesian Muslims in this case, because of course many people, many communities, different communities, they have their own kind of like trust or a degree of trust towards the MUI. But I also want to say that it's true that many people are skeptical to the MUI, mostly because many people think that it's kind of like driven by the government. So it's not really, their position is not really coming from, say, an Islamic position, but also from like a political one. So I think that's what I can say about your question.
Okay. With that, we can all give Amrina an applause. I don't know how to applause on my own screen, but putting up a yellow hand somehow applauds. Obviously, this is the first time I've done this. But anyway, good job, Amrina. And thank you again to Anu and to Hiro and to those of you who asked such excellent questions. I also want to say that we have more than 80 participants in the symposium, which is a huge number. It's more than have ever participated in the Arryman Symposium in person. So maybe this is a sign we should do it this way forever. That's just a joke. We're not going to do it this way forever. But anyway, thank you everybody for showing up. We're not going to lose any of our momentum. We're going to go directly into the next session. Because the Indonesians in particular, it's getting late at night there, so we don't want to keep you up too late. We're now going to do something which is very new for the Arryman Symposium. It had always been a symposium for first-year students like Amrina to showcase their work at the end of their research year. But this year, Amrina is the very last Arryman Fellow who has been recruited into the program. And it just so happens that her presentation coincides with the very first graduates of the program all these many years later. So we have two people we are showcasing today who have just defended their doctoral theses. They've crossed the finish line, they're at the end, and you'll see by looking at them, looking at Luthfi, how tired he looks after all of this incredible effort. And yet, masih ada semangat. Still full of energy nevertheless. So I'm going to turn this over to Luthfi Adam. Let me just say that Luthfi's committee, his doctoral committee, was made up of his chair, Hayden Cherry, who on behalf of the program we would like to thank very much. Also in history, Professor Keith Woodhouse, and from political science, me. We were the three committee members, and we've very much enjoyed working with Luthfi. I'll just say before turning over the floor to Luthfi that he defended his dissertation with distinction in the history department. That is quite rare, but it is a mark of his very excellent work. And so now, without any further delay, I would like to introduce Luthfi Adam. The title of his doctoral thesis is Cultivating Power, the Buitenzorg Botanic Garden and Empire Building in the Netherlands East Indies, 1745 to 1917. And with that, the floor is yours, Luthfi. Luthfi, this is a job talk. We're all going to decide whether we want to hire you or not. So go ahead and give it your best.
All right. Thank you, Jeffrey, for introducing me. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. So I'm happy to present some parts of my dissertation manuscript. And as Jeffrey has informed us that the main title of my dissertation is Cultivating Power. And the dissertation is indeed about how the Dutch cultivated their power in the East Indies through the growing capacity of a botanic garden that was created as a scientific institution to master the knowledge of flora and the methods of cultivation in Dutch East Indies. The original name of the garden was Slaan Plantentuin te Buitenzorg, or the State Botanic Garden at Buitenzorg. And throughout this presentation, I will call it Buitenzorg Botanic Garden or Buitenzorg Garden. And today in Indonesia, this garden is famous as Kebun Raya Bogor, or Bogor Great Garden. It is located in the heart of the city of Bogor, 62 kilometers from Jakarta. So why this botanic garden is an important topic for understanding Dutch empire building. In the historiography of science and technology, both of those who studied colonial Indonesia and the Netherlands, a few historians had acknowledged Buitenzorg Garden as playing a major role in Dutch empire building and the development of the discipline of botany. These historians, however, mainly interested in examining a few scientists at Buitenzorg Garden that they view as important figures in the development of botany and in colonial politics. I'm sorry, I have my daughter here and my wife is working, so there will be some pause in my presentation, so I hope you guys understand. Meanwhile, in the historiography of colonial agriculture, historians have contributed to the economic and social history of colonial plantation and its exploitative impact to the Indonesian people. The role of scientific activities and research institutions that supported the expansion of agriculture, such as Buitenzorg Garden, however, remain unexplored. My dissertation tries to contribute to the set historiography by examining the deeply intertwined development of colonial botany and colonial agriculture, therefore connecting the history of knowledge with the history of agriculture. I argue that the expansion of the Dutch colonial agriculture heavily relied on Buitenzorg Garden's growing capacity as a center of colonial knowledge production of botany and agriculture. In Buitenzorg Garden, the development of the research of botany and agriculture were intertwined, and their strong connection was foundational in the making of the modern colonial state of Netherlands Indies in the early 20th century, as well as vital for the development of the discipline of botany. Second, I argue that the environmental situation of Buitenzorg or Bogor played a significant role in the way the Dutch established the center of botanical and agricultural research there. Located between the lowland of Batavia and the highland of West Java, the Buitenzorg Garden became the critical agent for colonial scientific and agricultural expansion into the highland of West Java. The Dutch were aware that they built the town of Buitenzorg in the area formerly known as Pajajaran, the capital of the Kingdom of Sunda. Pajajaran was a fertile land, also controlled a vast area of fertile land in the mountainous interior of West Java. As I will be presented in the symposium, that the taming the extreme environment in Buitenzorg and Priangan Highland, as conducted by botanists and gardeners of Buitenzorg Garden, played a vital role in how the Dutch Empire expanded its agricultural enterprise. In my presentation this morning, I would like to focus on telling the story of the vertical movement of the colonial botanists and gardeners in surveying and controlling the nature in Java's highlands. Specifically, I will tell the story of how gardeners and botanists opened a new scientific frontiers as they followed the vertical elevation of West Java's landscape to remake the wilderness into laboratory for botanical studies and agricultural experimentation. In my dissertation, this is my third chapter. The creator of the Buitenzorg Garden was Caspar Reinward. He was a German botanist and chemist who was appointed by the King Willem I as the Director of Agriculture, Arts and Sciences of the newly established state of the Netherlands East Indies. Reinward created the garden in May 1817 to solve the dual problem of Dutch empire building. First, the promotion of science, and second, the improvement of colonial agriculture. Buitenzorg Garden status was an independent department, even though it was located around the Buitenzorg Palace. Buitenzorg was not connected to the management of Buitenzorg Palace. Besides being a repository of botanical collection and the study of flora, for studying the flora of the East Indies, the garden was responsible to introduce new plants for the other parts of the world, especially those with commercial benefits. As soon as constructing Buitenzorg Garden, Reinward conducted botanical investigation to the highland of Buitenzorg. Informing his botanist fellows in Leiden University, Reinward argued that investigation of nature on Java was extremely different from doing so in the Netherlands, where the same number of hours of observation would result in encountering the same natural condition. On Java, within a few hours, someone climbing a mountain could travel across different climates, experiencing a great variety of air pressure and observing a different character of nature. The Dutch botanist, Reinward thought, would find this experience very bizarre yet exciting, because as they climbed higher, they could encounter a landscape richer in object for botanical study. Reinward returned to the Netherlands in 1822, and he was replaced by his deputy, the botanist and physician, also a German, Carl Ludwig Blume. In 1824, Blume conducted investigation to Mount Gede and Pangrango in Buitenzorg Highlands, and due to the extreme vertical elevation, European botanists relied on a large number of native servants who became porters, collectors, men who cleared the bush to make way, land expert. Plant expert and guards to protect against tiger and rhinoceros attacks. On their way up climbing Mount Gede, Blume and his Sundanese stopped at a swampy valley with some waterfalls at the elevation of 1620 meters above sea level. His 14 barometer showed the air pressure was 622 Pascal, while the thermometer showed the temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. Blume observed that at this altitude, he encountered vegetation typical of the northern hemisphere, coexisting with plants particular to a medium altitude. The environmental quality of this valley, which stretched across the slope of Mount Gede and Pangrango, called for a closer investigation. Blume thought that it was a pity that agriculture had not yet penetrated this area. Blume later returned to this place and named it Ciberem Valley. Blume's discovery of Ciberem and his description of the shifting environment from tropical to subtropical would become very important in the next 15 years as the gardeners and botanists sought new species for a acclimatization project. But not long after Blume climbed Mount Gede, Java War broke out. The colonial state then needed to cut the budget for Buitenzorg Garden. Blume left to the Netherlands and no funding available for the hiring a new director. Buitenzorg Garden was left to the hand of its gardener, two British gardeners who used to work for Kew Gardens, James Hooper and William Kent. The colonial government put Buitenzorg Garden as the subordinate of the management of Buitenzorg Palace, and also under the supervision of the colonial inspector of agriculture. Therefore, Buitenzorg Garden lost its autonomous status as a colonial scientific institution. During the Java War, from 1825 to 1830, the government instructed Buitenzorg Garden to introduce some important crops such as cotton, opium, cinnamon, and silk. And due to a better understanding with the environment of the highland, Buitenzorg could also introduce crops of higher region, such as tea. The first germinative seeds of tea were smuggled by Philip Franz von Siebold, a German physician and botanist who was stationed in Decima. I'm sorry about that. The first germinative seeds of tea were smuggled by Philip Franz von Siebold, a German physician and botanist who was stationed in Decima, Japan. The tea seeds from Japan arrived at Buitenzorg Garden in 1826. 1 year later, Buitenzorg Garden set up two tea plantations in different altitudes in highland of Buitenzorg and Priangan. Some tea seeds arrived from China in 1828, and in 1 year, Buitenzorg Garden was able to distribute these types of tea seeds to almost all European local administrators on Java. By 1829, with all these experimental efforts in tea gardens at different altitudes, the government began to feel confident that tea plantation enterprises could be developed on Java. The Java War ended in 1830, and in the historiography of Indonesia, this year was also known as the time when the implementation of the colonial cultivation system started. This system aimed at forcing Javanese to spare 1/5 of their paddy fields and also their labor to cultivate colonial exported crops, especially sugarcane and coffee. The one who introduced this system was Governor General Johannes van den Bosch. He was also brought with him his gardener, the 22 years old Johannes Elias Theismann. In 1830, the Governor General appointed Theismann as the curator of Buitenzorg Garden. When the cultivation system began to put in practice in most part of Java in Buitenzorg, meanwhile, Theismann continued to the planned introduction project. Theismann immediately in charge with the experimentation of the cultivation of tea cultivation. By the middle of 1830s, the garden would provide tea shrubs for any planters on Java attempting to establish a new tea garden. It helped make Java into a tea producer in 1835, the year when the first black and green teas from the island were sold in Amsterdam. Europeans in Buitenzorg and Batavia knew Theismann as a simple gardener with no special botanical knowledge. Unlike Ringworth and Blume, who had a degree in botany and medicine, Theismann only mastered gardening. And as a gardener, what Theismann did in his first 6 years was first to adjust the local environment and then to learn to cultivate plants in tropical soils. He routinely received seeds of plants from the Netherlands and was responsible to introducing them to the soil of Java. Many of the plants were important to supplying the Dutch population's diet. Buitenzorg Garden was Theismann's main site for the introduction of tropical plants, but he then found that the climate at Cipanas Palace was cooler because it was located on the slope of Mount Gede at an altitude about 1,200 meters above sea level. Tasman laid out a garden there as well, transferring important plants that could not survive in the warm climate at Buitenzorg, which was only 600 meters above sea level. One of the Governor-General van den Bosch's aim in the early 1830s was to introduce fruits to Java soil. Tasman went back and forth between Buitenzorg and Cipanas to experiment with seeds of fruits received from the Netherlands. For example, the raspberry. At the time, it took around 2 days from Buitenzorg to Cipanas. Unfortunately, the raspberry bore no fruit. A similar disappointing result occurred in the introduction of the apricot. Red plums did grow, but the fruit was watery and bitter. Peaches and pears were also introduced, but the fruit was inedible. The vineyards yield nothing but the occasional bunch of very small grapes. Apples fortunately grew very well. They were very tasty and perfumed the entire room. Tasman argued that unfavorable results from plant introduction were caused by the lack of botanical and agricultural experts. Working without an assistant, Tasman struggled to manage his gardens in Buitenzorg and Cipanas. Tasman had been complaining about the situation, and in 1837, he proposed that the government hire a new botanical expert to assist him and to make crop introduction more manageable. The new Governor-General, D.J. Earens, approved Tasman's proposal. Justus Karl Haskell, another German, and he was a doctor in physics and medicine, was employed an assistant curator of the Buitenzorg garden. Haskell presents returned the strong scientific foundation of the garden, which had disappeared after Bloom left. Haskell immediately refined the landscape of Buitenzorg by rearranging the plant collection based on their taxonomic family. This additional staff increased the mobility of the garden's personnel for surveying and constructing acclimatization garden in the highland of Buitenzorg. Tasman continued to develop the path toward the summit of Mount Gede that Bloom had paved earlier. Intrigued by Bloom's report about Ciberem Valley, Tasman decided to experiment with plant introduction in the same sites. In 1839, he laid out two acclimatization gardens. The first was at Ciberem, at 1,700 meters above sea level. The second was at the summit of Mount Pangrango, at 3,000 meters above sea level. 1 year later, in 1840, he laid out another garden at Kandang Badak, located at the saddle between Mount Gede and Pangrango, at 2,500 meters above sea level. These mountain gardens were constructed as an extension of Cipanas Garden. The creation of the new mountain gardens offered new sites for acclimatization project at different altitudes. By 1841, when Haskell visited Ciberem, he was surprised that the valley had become a well-landscaped garden. Its scenery reminded Haskell of his homeland in Germany. He reported that in Ciberem Garden, strawberries, peaches, white lilies, roses, and many more crops of temperate climates, which had failed to be grown in the fairly cool climate in Cipanas, were found here in lush greenery. Haskell witnessed the result of the, quote, tireless effort of the curator Tasman, unquote, which had also successfully produced, quote, the Dutch and Japanese vegetables to be had in this climate, unquote. At Ciberem Garden, Tasman also built a moss house with stables, a kitchen, and all other conveniences, which provided the tired mountain climbers a place for resting and refreshing. With the temperature about 70 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and 48 degrees at night, the place was very hospitable for Europeans to spend nights. The Governor-General was very proud of Tasman's success in gardening the area in the slope of Mount Gede and Pangrango. He began to perceive gardening not only as providing testing ground, but also as transforming the whole island of Java to gardens for colonial crops. Constructing plantations in this sense was gardening. Horticulture could not be separated from agriculture. Under the management of these gardeners, he wrote, Java has become a large pleasure garden, a beautiful garden. Diligent and hardworking gardeners had doubled the production capacity of the well-to-do soil. The skill of the gardeners had the colonial government led the colonial government to believe that the wealth of this country and the prosperity of its people was not in silver and gold mining, quote, but in agriculture and industry, unquote. As Bettensburg Garden controlled a series of mountain gardens, botanical exchange with other botanic institutions in other parts of the globe became more intensive. Tasman actively corresponded with Leiden and Amsterdam. Not only with Leiden and Amsterdam, but also with botanic gardens in Calcutta, Ceylon, Rio de Janeiro, Australia, Singapore, and many more. The kinds of important economic plants they received were exemplified by Elais Ginensis, sent by Botanic Garden in Amsterdam. Tasman immediately recognized that it was a variety of palm which produced oil, which and was already a major commodity off the coast of Guinea. The introduction of palm oil was very easy, and throughout 1850s, the trees became famous, not for its economic value, but rather for its ornamental value. From the Singapore garden, Tasman received Isonandra gutta, a variety of latex which had not yet been found on Java. From Calcutta garden, Bettensburg received Campeche wood, a product of a tree indigenous to Mexico, used in the Americas for dyeing as well as for medicine. Bettensburg Gardens also continued to collect the plants of the East Indies archipelago. Due to limited financial support, Bettensburg Gardens networked with colonial administrators, both European and natives, throughout the East Indies, became the key to botanical accumulation of the flora of both Java and the outer islands. A group of colonial engineers surveying the interior of Borneo sent trees called minyak tengkawang. Dayak people in Borneo extracted oil, which Europeans called butter tree oil. From the dried seeds of this tree, Dayak people use the oil widely for cooking and medicine. One of the most important seeds that Bettensburg received in 1850 was Cinchona alba from the Botanic Garden in Amsterdam. Tasman wrote in Bettensburg Garden's first public report in 1850 that they recommended, he recommended the plantations of Cinchona was the source of quinine, which was the source of quinine effective to cure malaria fever, to be established in a higher region. 1 year later, the Dutch Empire joined the race for cultivating Cinchona, which started with the race to obtain the seeds and living plants of the best Cinchona species known, which was the Cinchona calisaya. The British was reported to have started experimenting with cultivation this plant in India. The Botanic Garden at Leiden University succeeded in obtaining Cinchona calisaya plants from a botanical exchange with a horticulture company in Paris, and immediately sent the plants to Bettensburg. Although the plants arrived in bad condition, Tasman successfully took two cuttings in time. With the original plants died shortly after the arrival, one of the two cuttings grew in Bettensburg Garden and was transplanted in the ground between Cipanas and Ciberem Gardens. The local Sundanese called this ground, which was located at an altitude 1,300 meters above sea level, as Cibodas, meaning White River. Cibodas was chosen because its environment, altitude, temperature, and air pressure was similar to that of Cinchona's original habitat in South America. Cinchona calisaya grew successfully in Cibodas. The former assistant curator at Bettensburg Garden, Haskar, who had been living in Europe since 1844, went for a mission to South America to obtain more Cinchona living plants and seeds. The former assistant curator of Bettensburg Garden, J.K. Haskar, who had been living in Europe since 1844, went for a mission to South America to obtain more Cinchona living plants and seeds. Haskar successfully obtained them in Peru and returned to the Indies in 1854. Haskar agreed that Cibodas was the right site for acclimatizing his Cinchona plants and seeds. The altitude, geographical formation, temperature, and air pressure in Cibodas were similar to the environment of Cinchona had Haskar witnessed in Peru. Having successfully returned to the Indies with Kinkona specimens, Haskar was appointed director of Kinkona cultivation. The government decided that the Kinkona cultivation project was not a part of the management of Buitenzorg Garden. At that time, therefore, Buitenzorg lost control over Chibodas. In 1856, however, Haskar lost his job after the new Governor General Ferdinand Pahud chose his relative, the naturalist Franz Junghun, as the new director of Kinkona plantation. Junghun developed his own approach in cultivating Kinkona. He argued that the environment of Chibodas was not suitable, and then he removed all the Kinkona trees from Chibodas to Pangalengan in Priangan Highland. Buitenzorg Garden's botanists were disagreed with Junghun's approach, but Junghun was untouchable from any criticism since he was strongly guarded by the Governor General. Later, in the 1860s, Junghun's approach was proved wrong, and Buitenzorg Garden then returned to play a leading role in experimenting with more Kinkona species and varieties, which led to the making of Dutch East Indies as the producer of 90% quinine in the early quinine production in the early 20th century. After the transplantation of Kinkona introduction garden from Chibodas to Pangalengan, Chibodas was not closed, but rather was further improved as a botanic garden. The construction of Chibodas Garden started in 1860. The curator's house was built to enable Chibodas to replace Cipanas as the capital of the mountain gardens. Chibodas became the entrance to the forest on the slopes of the mountain Gede and Pangrango, where a network of mountain gardens was located. In the early 1860s, Chibodas was planted with a South American plant collection brought by Haskar, Australian plants imported by F. von Muller, and Japanese plants imported by von Siebold. With the construction of Chibodas, Buitenzorg Garden therefore controlled a network of gardens in 4 different elevation zones. Each garden represented the nature of its zone. The first zone was in between 0 to 650 meters above sea level, and the Buitenzorg Botanic Garden was located in this zone. The second zone was in between 650 and 1500 meters, and Chibodas Garden belonged to this zone. The third zone was in between 1500 and 2500 meters, and Kandang Badak Garden belonged to this zone. The fourth zone was from 25,000 to the crater of Mount Gede at 2962 meters and Mount Pangrango at 3022 meters. Cipanas Garden, which was located in the second zone, was closed and its collection transferred to Chibodas Garden. Chibodas Garden became the capital of this mountain garden network. Colonists began to call the mountain gardens network simply as Chibodas Mountain Garden. Now I have to apologize to those, especially Indonesian audience, who expected to hear me talking about Bogor Garden, but turned out you're hearing about Chibodas Garden. Yeah, because today it seemed that Chibodas Garden had no connection with Buitenzorg Garden. What I try to discuss in this presentation is to have a more comprehensive understanding about the role of Buitenzorg Garden in Dutch Empire building. We need not only tracing the garden scientists' contribution to science, but also, and most importantly, to the main project of empire building in the 19th century, which was agriculture. And throughout the 1825 and 1869, the year when Buitenzorg Garden managed by a gardener, not a scientist, Buitenzorg Garden emerged as an influential institution which helped the colonial government to expand its agricultural enterprise. The key for its growing influence in colonial agriculture was Buitenzorg Garden's movement following the elevation of land. Botanists and gardeners at Buitenzorg established a new approach in understanding Java. The higher you climb, the richer natural object you find. Climbing jagged volcanoes on Java emerged as the main form of botanical surveying, leading to an understanding that the environmental formation in the mountains, consisting chiefly of sands, ashes, and dust, produce fertile agricultural soil. Having 5 different gardens in varying altitudes, the Dutch were able to acclimatize various kinds of plants, most importantly, commercial crops. In total, 50 new commercial plants were introduced by Buitenzorg gardeners under Tasman administration, including vanilla, sweet cassava, palm oil, Arabic gum tree, mahogany wood, cotton, and various European fruits. The list of commercial plants was foundational to the growing interest in expanding plantation to the highland and to the founding of the Society of Mountain Planters in 1870s. The success in plant introduction then changed the government's perception toward Buitenzorg garden. The government began to position botanists and gardeners at Buitenzorg as inspector and advisor of agricultural affairs. Tasman was appointed as the honorary inspector of agriculture. He played a vital role in introducing various colonial crops in Outer Island, such as introduced palm oil to Bangka, Biliton, and Riau in the island of Sumatra. As the influence of Buitenzorg garden increased in the 1860s, Tasman began to propose to the Governor General for the restoration of Buitenzorg garden as an independent scientific institution under a leadership of scientists. The government approved the proposal in 1863, and in 1869, finally a new director, a botanist graduated from Utrecht University, Rudolf Schever, arrived on Java. Finally, for the first time in 40 years, Buitenzorg garden was led by its own director. Buitenzorg garden's autonomous status was restored. Buitenzorg garden was no longer a small division under the management of the Governor General Parks and Palaces. So to conclude, historians of Indonesia have overlooked the role of Tasman, a gardener in the history of colonial science and agriculture, and more attracted to exploring the role of prominent naturalists such as Van Junghoen, or Buitenzorg's most famous director such as Caspar Reinward, and especially Melchior True. They tend to see the period between 1830 and 1870, exactly the tenure of Tasman leadership at the garden, as less interesting compared with the earlier or later period in the 19th century. The story that I tell about Tasman aim at contributing to fill the gap in the historiography of colonialism, colonial science, and colonial agriculture of Indonesia. I argue that Tasman played an important role in tidying up the garden and re-establishing the colonial government's faith in the importance of Buitenzorg gardens in expanding capability in agriculture. For the next director, Tasman's success in rehabilitating the autonomous status of the garden resulted in the increased government's financial support toward the improvement of Buitenzorg gardens landscape and organization. For example, under Schever's administration, Buitenzorg garden then opened a new branch, the Garden of Economic Botany at Chikema. This garden functioned at an agricultural station, which connected to every planter in the East Indies. This new branch distributed various seeds and planters needed free of charge. Most importantly, the Garden of Economic Botany was a center for the knowledge about economic plants and their methods of cultivation. It was a center for education for European planters, European and native agricultural inspectors. Finally, the vertical movement of Buitenzorg garden, which resulted in the construction of Cibodas Garden, played a vital role in the making of Buitenzorg as the main destination of international botanists to study the tropical nature. In 1880s, the then director Melchior True further improved the condition of Cibodas Garden as he envisioned that the garden could become a natural laboratory for all botanists all over the world. Especially, True envisioned that Cibodas and its surrounding environment fit for Darwinian investigation in plant adaptation and colonization. In 1889, True proposed for the preservation of the vast area of jungle adjacent to Cibodas Garden, exclusive only for botanical research. Cibodas therefore became the first nature reserve in the East Indies, or Indonesia. Cibodas Garden area was only 20 hectares, but it controlled 1,040 hectares tropical jungles with different climatic conditions due to the vertical elevation of its landscape. He also constructed a laboratory. Trube's vision was successful. Botanists all over the world, ranging from Russia to the US, from Japan to Britain, did visited Cibodas and enjoyed the environment there as as if it was their laboratory. Especially, Cibodas became the most important venue for the research agenda of German botanists, such as Ernst Haeckel, who coined the term ecology. By the end of the 19th century, it was Cibodas which became well known as a pearl in the crown of the Netherlands Indies within international natural science communities. Thank you for hearing my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Luthfi. Yes, much applause. Well done. I don't know how to do thumbs up and hands, so I just do the real thing. All right, at this point, we would like to open up the floor to any questions or comments. There is a raise hand function. Also, as I look at the screen, I can try to see you physically raise your hand if you don't know how to digitally raise your hand. Do we have any hands raised? Looks like Ted Fishman. Can we unmute Ted Fishman, please, Beth?
Yes.
All right, go ahead, Ted.
Okay, there we go. Is it? You got the sound there?
Yes, go ahead.
Hey, what a fascinating presentation, Luthfi. Congratulations. You really went all over the world for this, and it's very moving to hear. I had a few. Well, first a comment. I think what you've done, which is so brilliant, is you've opened up the scholarship to these very sophisticated industrial modes that are pre the carbon era.
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating and underappreciated. In the era of the focus on the Anthropocene and so on, we forget this previous era which reshaped the world just as much,
Yeah.
or at least very significantly. I have three questions for you. One, I was wondering whether you could discuss the role of competition in pushing the botanic sciences forward. What were the Spanish doing in the Philippines, the English in Malaysia and India, and maybe the Portuguese are still active in Brazil? Do they have competing gardens and competing crops that are a competitive threat to the Dutch? Or are the Dutch aping their methods and their competitive threat to these other countries, empires? And the second is, what were the target markets for the Dutch products? Were they the intra-Asia market largely, or were they traveling back to Europe? And related to that, what was the role of the colonial mercantilism in closing their markets? You know, did it limit different markets to them, or did it open different markets because of relationships that the Dutch had with other empires? And then the last one is, how free was the spread of horticultural knowledge at this time? Was it proprietary industrial knowledge? You mentioned that all these different scientists are coming through the gardens. Are they coming through as in a kind of capacity as you know, academics, as agricultural industry spies? You know, the Netherlands can bring seeds from other empirical domains into Java. Are these other people who are visiting the Dutch gardens in Java collecting seeds and bringing them back to their own things and then creating competition? Palm oil, maybe. Anyway, that's it. But congratulations, wonderful.
Okay.
These are really hard questions.
Hold on, Luthfi. Let's see if we can get maybe one more questioner,
Okay.
and then you can take them together.
Sure.
Do we have anyone with their hand up?
Nika and Dika, I think.
Okay. Do we have anyone with a hand up?
Go ahead, Dika.
Nika and Dika. Maybe you can start with Dika.
Is Dika raised hand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Oh yeah, go ahead, Dika.
Thank you so much, Luthfi. You know that I'm always a big fan of your work. I'm an honored colleague because I've been witnessing how this project unfold throughout the time. I believe this is a hard work paid off. And you took me to Cibodas Garden and to the Bogor Botanical Garden too. And that was a very good experience to me and a lot of learning sessions by itself. And I think this is a very fascinating project. You present a very comprehensive and rich historical data into your project to see how this empirical building throughout the lens of building a natural botanical garden, and to see how then it evolved into how the colonies conquering the environment and then conquering the subjects in the empire building in the Netherlands Indies. But what really intrigued me is actually the first opening of your paper about how these scientists, the botanists, they hired native plants expert to hike up to the elevated area in Java, and then help them to identify what are the important plants to be cultivated. So I'm just wondering if moving along this Buitenzorg garden as well as the Chiboros garden can be a microcosm or the representations that further shaped the racial relations in the knowledge productions within the empire building moving forward, particularly during the time when the botanical garden serves with the purpose of cultivating these economic valuable corpses that became a global commodities. Thank you so much. That's all my question.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see we also have, we're going to take one more question in this round from Nika.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. Kang Upi, congratulations for your dissertation and presentation. At least for the past 2 years, I've been talking a lot with you, with Norman and Ayu too. So congratulations. And I think you make a really good stories for this presentation about how Buitenzorg garden play around on both vertical movements and also horizontal movements, because somehow historians often focus on one of them, but not on the integration between two. So I think the integration between horticultural specimens through vertical movement and the plantation on the horizontal movement is really clear and very compelling. So I think that's the strength of your presentation today. I have 3 quick questions. The first one is perhaps on your elaboration on the scientific frontier or landscape. I'm wondering, how do you actually conceptually develop the idea of frontier? Because this word is kind of like used to explain about the boundary, the area, the middle ground where, how to say, the so-called indigenous land and then the expansion of empire. So I'm wondering how you contribute or conceptually develop this concept, and how do you think the process of zonation based on the altitude actually develop this area or middle ground? That's my first question. And the second one, you focus on the story of Theisman, right? Because he was the one who tidying up the garden, in short, set the ground for the further scientific inquiries continued by Theisman's predecessors. But I'm wondering to what extent his work and legacy persisted. There's a reason why, for example, Trup or Jung-hoon become the kind of like the protagonist of this kind of story. But I'm wondering why Theisman was left out, and perhaps it's related to the discontinuation of his work and legacy. So I'm wondering how you explain about the continuation of Theisman's work. And the last thing is very broad and general question. How do you reflect in writing your dissertation? How do you reflect on the relationship between environment, science, and expansion of state power? Because after we always think this is a colonial project, empire project, but I'm wondering if we continue this story, especially after the post-colonial era, for example. I'm wondering how your story reflect on this relationship between 3 elements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nika. Let's give Luthfi a chance to respond.
Okay, thank you. So for Ted, I'm actually quite surprised that I'm using a lot of scientific reports, scientific scientific reports, a lot of scientific reports and correspondence between scientists of Buitenzorg Garden with other botanists all over the world, and from scientist point of view, it seems like the competition is, it seems like it's more about collaboration instead of competition. I know, like in the story about King Kona, there's a lot of competition with the British, for example. But after that period, after Buitenzorg Garden emerged as in the 1880s, for example, in the troops under troops administration, the scientists actually very collaborative. So the role of competition between empires are there, but between scientists, surprisingly, is very collaborative. And then, yes, kenapa? Wait, I have to give a treat for my daughter first. So this is the key for those students with daughter, students, parents. You have to stock all of this, many of this. There you go. You happy now?
Bagi-bagi dong.
Bagi-bagi. There's Om Ted over there. Say hi to Om Ted. Okay. Yeah, I can go on, with the collaboration story. For example, your last question about why did many scientists visited Buitenzorg? What were their intention? They were invited, and Buitenzorg in the Netherlands, even the director of Buitenzorg traveled, to Britain, to the United States, to invite scientists to come to Java to enjoy the facilities in Buitenzorg and Cibodas, to use the space for botanical research. And also, and it's very interesting, and I tell the story in my fifth chapter, that those scientists then learned not only doing research for their own, but also they learn about how to manage the colonial lands. So Buitenzorg Gardens emerged as the example of how an empire could improve their colonies. So, for example, the Americans, when they're improving the Philippines, for example, they learn from Buitenzorg. The German, because there are a lot of German scientists coming to Buitenzorg and studying, conducting their research there. They're building the Amani Agricultural Institute in 1902, and it was modeled from Buitenzorg. So instead of competition in my dissertation, I more focused on collaboration and cooperation, and for on-market products, both. So they sent to Europe, but they also thought about how to provide foods for Europeans themselves in the colony in Java. That's why they introduced apples, strawberries. If you go to Cibodas Garden, they will there's so many pedagang asongan, the street vendors who sell us strawberries, for example, and that's basically not to be exported to Europe, but for local consumption. I'm going to Dika. So the racial problem, yeah, I emphasize this racial problems in my fourth and fifth chapter. That's right. Basically, the knowledge production in Buitenzorg Gardens essentially is actually the translation of local knowledge owned by many native experts, Javanese, Sundanese, Chinese, being transferred, being translated into scientific languages, right? And in many botanical investigations, such as conducted by Renward and Blume, which I was talking about in this presentation, there were so many natives helping this kind of investigation. For Renward's investigation, there were 100 plant experts, and not only plant experts, but 100 Sundanese supporting, helping Renward, playing role as porters, but also plant expert. In my fifth chapter, in chapter 5, I tell a story about Pak Idan, for example, and he was the staff at the herbarium at Buitenzorg Garden, and Pak Idan and many botanists of Buitenzorg Garden argued that it was Pak Idan actually who had the full knowledge about the flora of Dutch East Indies, not the European scientists. And many European visiting researchers coming from Europe actually learn from Pak Idan. But the problem is, I didn't see Pak Idan's appear in archive a lot. There's no proper space in the colonial archive for such native experts such as Pak Idan, for example, and it leads me to the conclusion that it's we can talk about racial problems within the discussion about scientific institution such as Buitenzorg Garden, but the role of native in Buitenzorg Garden was vital. Nika, I will try to answer the last question first, which is the connection between science, state, and agriculture in the later period, or how do I think about the legacy of the problem between the relationship between science and state. So what happened I will take an example from Dika's comment about the role of native, for example. 2 weeks ago, I told my friend at Buitenzorg, at LIPI Botany, at LIPI division on botany, that about Pak Idan, for example, and he said that the problem with the staff who don't hold a degree in science cannot have like a proper position in such a scientific institution. And it makes me think about the role of scientists in Indonesia, which usually doesn't put enough attention toward the process of knowledge production, for example. Second, the connection between science and state that happened in the colonial period. I tell the story about the disconnection between pure science and applied science. In my presentation today, what I'm trying to talk about is actually how pure science of botany and a more practical science, applied science of agriculture, were intertwined. But later, in the early 20th century, it was breaking apart. And it's the center of my 5th chapter. And this disconnection, it continued until today, I think. We in Indonesians is familiar with the term ego sectoral. yeah, the ego-sectoral kind of moment also happened in 1904, where when Botanic Garden was transformed into the Department of Agriculture, and then the pure applied science disconnected with a more applied science, and this disconnection, I think, can be seen in today's disconnection between botany and agriculture, for example. In Bogor, if we are familiar in Bogor, I think Sindu is familiar with Bogor, of course, because Sindu is from there. Do we really understand that Buitenzorg Garden with the complex of Pertanian campus, the agricultural center in Cimanggu, was actually used to be an institution, used to be, belong to one institution, but now it seems like they are disconnected. Surrounding Botanic Garden, there were so many research centers, for example, like Pertanian Center or the Museum Tanah, the Soil Museum. It came from the same institution, but we don't really see, that today they are connected each other. I will address the other questions from Nika later, maybe, Nika, because there's some other friends who want to ask some questions.
Yes. Okay. I see one hand raised by Conrad Hirano. Maybe before you start, Conrad, I'm just going to ask a very brief question of you, Luthfi, which is one way of grasping how important the phenomenon of the botanical gardens is by engaging in a counterfactual. Had the gardens not existed, how do you think the Dutch colonization of Indonesia would likely have been different? I know that's a very speculative kind of thing to try to address, but it helps give us an idea of the centrality or the importance of this for the nature of the colonization that ends up occurring. Regionally, the spread, timing, nature of crops, creation of plantations, and so on. And so I'm wondering if you had to name one or two things that you think really would have been different had, for whatever reason, this garden not been created, what would those be? So that would be my question. And let's turn now to Conrad, please. Oh, we need your sound, Conrad.
See. Okay, hope you hear me. Luthfi, thank you so much for your presentation and congratulations as well. And I have one question. So I think dairy farming was already big in Netherlands at the time. Did Dutch people try to expand dairy farming industry in East Indies? And if so, did Buitenzorg play any role in experimenting on grass? What kind of grass works in Java, or what kind of grass prosper? And I think dairy farming is part of agriculture, at least in US context. So was dairy farming any part of consideration by Buitenzorg?
Okay, thank you very much, Conrad.
I just want to clarify. So the question was on farming.
Conrad, can you follow up briefly with clarify the question?
Sure. So the question was dairy farming. So basically dairy, they produce milk or cheese, by raising cows, and for cows they had to feed them with grass. So this Buitenzorg experiment on grass so that Dutch people can establish and expand dairy farming industry in East Indies.
Okay. Luthfi, we are going to, maybe these are going to be the last two questions for you. How about 3 to 5 minutes,
Okay.
and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead.
Okay, on dairy farming, yes, they are experimenting with grass. They're experimenting with grass, and later also with diseases on on cattle. So the next expansion of Buitenzorg Garden, actually, you know, they were studying diseases not only for plants but also for cattle, for fisheries industries, and also for dairy farming. To Jeffrey, how if there was no Buitenzorg Botanic Garden? My simple question is, there will be no Department of Agriculture in the Netherlands is Indies. And if there was no Department of Agriculture, there was no ethical policy. So the ethical policy that emerged in 1900s really relied on the capacity of an institution in the Netherlands is Indies in improving the agriculture. And at that period, there was two institutions that took care of agriculture. First is the Inspectorate of Agriculture under the Department of what they call Binnenlandsbestuur, or the Interior Administration. And second, Buitenzorg Botanic Garden. The central government thought that the interior administration had failed in improving the native agriculture. So they turned toward Buitenzorg Garden because it was the center of expertise on agriculture and botany. So then Buitenzorg Botanic Garden played an initiative role in the development of a new department that became like the backbone of the ethical policy. The creation of the Department of Agriculture of the Netherlands is Indies, initiated then by Buitenzorg Gardens. So when if we think about Indonesia today, for example, Indonesia has the Department of Agriculture. Indonesia has the Ministry of Economy, and then Department of Fishery, and so on and so on. There's so many departments in Indonesia today who actually, came from Buitenzorg Garden, especially emerged from the Department of Agriculture, which was initiated. And basically, the Buitenzorg Botanic Gardens in 1904 was transformed itself into the Department of Agriculture because it already functioned as a Department of Agriculture since 10 years, since the last decade of the 19th century. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. I think I've discovered my applause symbol. Yep, there it is. All right. And now we're going to turn from Luthfi's presentation to our second doctoral thesis presentation. And that one is by Muhammad Fajar in the Department of Political Science. The dissertation he successfully defended is entitled The Path to Preemption, the Politics of the Indonesian Student Movements During the Regime Transition 1998 to 1999 in Indonesia. His doctoral committee was composed of myself, Bill Hurst, Professor Hurst, and Professor Wendy Perlman. And so we're going to turn it over now to Fajar, and welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff, and the others for attending my presentations. So before I start, I want to share my presentation slides. Okay, thank you so much. So as Jeffrey has told, the title for my presentation today is The Path to Preemptions, the Politics of Indonesian Student Movements During the Regime Transitions in 1998 and 1999. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Indonesian history and what happened in the 1998, so basically the story was the Asian financial crisis struck Indonesia in 1997, and it gave an opportunity for Indonesian student movements to organize and to rise against Suharto. The end of the story was Indonesian student movement, they succeeded to topple Suharto, and they managed to realize some of their demands, like amending the 1945 constitutions, initiating like a regional autonomy, and also pushing for an election to be held in the next year in 1999. But they also failed, for instance, to bring Suharto into trial, also to establish like a government clean from corruption, collusion, and nepotisms. They also failed to get like a political position inside the Indonesian state. Maybe most of you think that, this is what actually students do during regime transitions. But I want to argue here that Indonesia is not like the only path, because students in other contexts, they follow actually different trajectories. Like for instance, in Guatemala, students during the 1944 revolution against Ubico's regimes, I think they managed to enter the state and also becoming the members of the People Consultative Assembly. And they also managed to push for reforms, especially in the educational sector. While for another pattern was in Iran, when the students managed to get into the state, although some of their demands, especially from the nationalists and the leftist students, to establish like a democratic state, failed, because as you know, in the story, the Islamist forces managed to take over the power and also install theocracy there. The focus of my dissertation is on the Indonesia's path toward preemptions, meaning when the students could realize some of their demands, but they failed to get a position inside the states. I think the importance of my study has several reasons here. First, I think in the literature on the Indonesian student movements, I think there are focuses on different moments of students. Like for instance, they protested against the rise of tuition fees. They protested against the Vietnamese War, or during the 1980s, there was the protest by American students against the divestment, I guess. But what I want to focus here is to put on the lens on this very specific of transition moment, regime transition moment. For those scholars that have focused on the transition moment, I argue that I think there's a lack of precise definition of success of students during that transition moment. I believe that if we have like a very precise definition of success, I think in the future, I mean, post factum, I think we can think of to what extent that actually students have succeeded during this regime transition moment. I also argue, I think there's an importance here that there's an opportunity here for theorizing like what is like the foundation for like a long-term change. Because I assume here, I think long-term change, I think it's built based on a series of success, which is included the success during the regime transition moment. So my argument actually rests on several key assumptions here. So the first, I want to say that I think we need to admit that students, they have a potential as the initiator of change. So what I mean by the initiator of change is that the students, they usually become like the first political actors who go onto the street and protested against the regimes and also test the tolerance of the regimes on the agenda brought up by the students. Then after the students protest, I think other social forces usually follow and they make up like a massive popular movement. I think that's like the pattern and the potential of students. But on the other hand, I think we also need to admit that there is also like a limitation of students as the initiator of change. What is so clear is that the status as a student is like only like temporarily, because they only become students for like 4 to 5 years or even 6 years. And after that, they need to think further how, for instance, how to get a job in the job market and etc. And I think this is when the importance of opposition groups comes in. To go beyond their potential as students, I think students need like a deep and strong alliance with opposition groups. Because opposition groups, they can like provide like a resources, they can provide skills, they can educate students to do what do you need to do after the fall of regimes. But I also want to say that the roles of the opposition groups to assist students is very much like limited by the roles of the state repression, because it very much depends on the degree of the state repressions here. What I want to argue is the path to preemption only occurs when the state repression could destroy or demobilize opposition groups. Then the consequence is the students would not have like a strong partner that could boost them into the state. Moreover, not only demobilize oppositions, I think the state repressions also brings like a fragmentation consequences among students themselves. And what I want to show you next is to highlight these two things. The first is like the heavy state repressions on students and how this the state repressions actually trigger fragmentations among students. So I think on the heavy state repressions, I think for those of you who are not familiar with the Indonesian history, I want to say that the moment of the heavy state repression, I think, occurred during the purge of the left during the 1965 and 1967 period. So what happened in that period was the Indonesian Communist Party attempted to do like a coup on September 30, 1965. To cut the story short, the coup failed, and it provided like a pretext for Suharto and the military to launch like a coup or to launch like an eliminations to the Indonesian Communist Party. What happened next is Suharto and the military, they mobilized some mass organizations. They also mobilized the anti-communist student movements and launched the purge against the Indonesian Communist Party. So they catch the leadership of the party, they catch members and the sympathizers of the party, and also social organizations that had like a relations with the party. So the result, I think, was really massive because the purge itself, it took around like 500,000 to 1 million casualties across Indonesia. What I think also important is the purge itself also eliminated like around 20 to 22 educational institutions related to the Indonesian Communist Party, and also the leftist student organizations like Perhimi and CGMI. The purge, I think, did not stop there because it paved the way for the rise of the new order repressive machines. Like for instance, during the 1970s and 1980s, I think there was the so-called the party fusion policy that intended to limit the number of political parties in Indonesia into 3 political parties. So there was the government supported party, Golkar, and there was also a PPP party that was intended to be the house for the Islamic forces, and also PDI as a party for the nationalist forces and the secular organizations. I think the regime also followed up that policy with the floating mass policy. So except Golkar, I think PPP and PDI, they could not have like branches, at least until the sub-district level. While Golkar, they could have like branches or networks until the village level. So this advantage for Golkar, I think it gives Golkar advantages during the elections throughout the new order regimes. So they could like dominate the elections for like 32 years. For students themselves, I think we need to pay attention to policies like the normalizations of the campus life installed in 1978 and 1974 and 1978. And what this policy did to students was to eliminate the leadership of students, at least at the university level, and also restricted political activities of students from the campus. So political parties, they could not have like networks or student organization that represented them at the university level. So, so you have this during the 1970s and 1980s, all of these state repressive machines that limited the space for opposition groups to make like a connection with students, right? But on the other hand, it also gave trigger opposition groups to change their tactics a little bit, especially for the small opposition groups like the leftist NGOs and also Islamic groups like Jamaah Tarbiyah. They rose because of the consequence of the state repressions. So they tried to adapt with the state repressions by using campuses as their ground to mobilize support. So what I want to say next is, what are like the consequences of the presence of these small opposition groups inside the campus? What I want to say here is their presence were actually, well, on the one hand, they help to mobilize students, prepare them to anticipate what's gonna happen, especially during the crisis. But on the other hand, I think the presence of these organizations, they also have this the fragmentation consequences among students. I think in the past studies, I think there are lots who argued about the fragmentation of students. But what I want to say here, I think we also need to think about the social origins and also the roots of these fragmentations that I argue already that was already there. I mean, during the 1990s. And I cannot see a better like a context than during the campus elections in the 1990s. So in 1990, I think the regimes allowed the students to have like a leadership at the university level called the Senat Mahasiswa Perguruan Tinggi, if you're familiar with that. And the regime also allowed the students to decide, so what kind of mechanisms that they want to use to choose their own leadership. But of course, with very much a degree of control from the university. I think in campuses like UI and IKIP Jakarta and other public universities, I think the mechanism that they use was like a direct election, so one man, one vote. But during my interviews with my informants, I think the stories around this student senate elections say more about how the fragmentation actually occurred between them. So for instance, in UI and IKIP Jakarta, I think there were like a rivalry between the so-called the leftists and the progressive students, and also the Islamic students, mostly represented by the Jamaah Tarbiyah. And during the competition between them, I think both of them equally used these political jargons that I think was so familiar with the New Order regimes. So for instance, you have this kind of quote when the Islamic students, they use this communist label against their competitors from the leftist and the progressive students. Conversely, the leftist and the progressive students, they used labels something like the rookie Islams or their competitor as fanatics. What I want to argue further is that the fragmentations among students did not stop there because it continued until the student mobilizations in 1998. So after the crisis struck in 1997, the students, they had their momentum to mobilize their own. And I think the stories from my informants during the period of January to April showed how actually the fragmentation occurred between these two groups and people from the same groups. But the form of the fragmentation actually took another form. So during the student mobilizations in 1998, The fragmentation occurred between the student senate and the informal student organizations. The student senates, they were, especially in the public universities, they were mostly dominated by Islamic students, represented by the Jamaah Tarbiyah, while the informal student organizations, they were dominated by leftists and the progressive students. During the competition of mobilizing students during this period, I found that there were an accusations going around between the students. So for instance, the informal student organizations, they accused the student senate as moving too slow. So they didn't take the momentum to mobilize a larger movement. While from the students from the student senate, they accused the informal student group as a illegitimate student force or student group. There was also the tactical differences between these two groups, between the student senates and the informal student organizations. The student senates, they tended to not take risk in mobilizing students. They prefer tactics like social charity, or even if they protested, they tended to contain their protests inside their own campuses. While the informal student organizations, I think they were more dare to take a risk and go outside their university gates to challenge the police and the military. The fragmentations during the student mobilization did not stop there, because actually the fragmentation continued until during the occupation of the House of Representatives between May 18 until May 21st, 1998. So the story was after the shooting of the Trisakti students, it provoked rage among people, and it created riots across Indonesia, right? The students from different kind of groups, they decided to occupy the DPR, and you can see this flow of students during this period between 18 and May 21st, 1998. Maybe the image that we often see is that, oh, so now they were united against Suharto, because that was actually the main agenda during the occupations. But from my interviews and from my conversations with the informants, I think you get this story that actually, even though they were in the same place in the DPR, I think you can see this story of the fragmentation was persisting during that time. For instance, you can see an accusations from the informal student organizations toward the student senate, that toward the student senate and also the Islamic student organization, that, oh, actually these students, they did not do anything. They did not do anything to mobilize students, and they only wanted to take over the moments inside the DPR. And that's what actually happened when the students from the student senates and also from the Islamic students, they tried to dominate the stage inside DPR during the occupations. You can also see it from, the fragmentation from different strategies inside DPR. On the one hand, you have this formal student organizations that try to maintain the exclusivity or the purity of the student movements by sealing off the gates from other social forces, versus like opinion from the informal student organization that actually student movements cannot stop as student movements. They need to merge with other social forces to become a larger movement, to become a popular movement. As you can see it from the quote that represented actually the position or the political stance of the informal student organizations during the occupations. During the occupation and the student mobilization, the students, they actually did not have like a very strong support, especially from the opposition groups. Like for instance, after the July 27, 1996, I think Megawati Soekarno Putri, I think she kept her silence from 1996 until the fall of the Suharto. You also had this very, I think, strange from current point of view when actually Gus Dur endorsed Golkar during the 1997 general elections. So without like a very strong support from the oppositions, I think the students were alone and very much fragmented during the occupations. The story after the occupation was that Suharto, he resigns on May 21st, 1998, and the Habibie replaced him as the interim president. But the rise of the Habibie did not stop the fragmentations. It actually amplified the fragmentation among students and divided them into like two groups. The first group was the pro-Habibie, or those who favored the gradualist approach to the transitions. So they favored more on the transition to be peaceful and follow the democratic procedure like the elections. And they could accept Habibie with some like critical notes. While another group, I mean the second camp, was the contra Habibie groups who could not accept Habibie at all, and they wanted for Habibie to step down at that time and be replaced by a committee filled by pro-reform people. And what I want to argue is there's not like there's nothing better case to see the fragmentations during the Habibie period other than when the special session occurred on November 10 until 13, 1998. So the special sessions, it was held by the MPR, and it aimed to build like the foundation of how to go forward from the fall of Suharto. So they wanted to install like rules and regulations and also political institutions to guide the transitions into like a democratic regime. The opposition groups like Megawati, Abdurrahman Wahid, Amin Rais, and also Sultan Hamengkubuwono, they chose their own way to push for a gradualist approach. And some students actually supported the political elites for this kind of gradualist approach to the transitions. And in fact, I think the students themselves, they were the one who gathered these four political elites and gave their mandate to the political elites to declare the Ciganjur declarations, which I think reflected very much this gradualist approach toward the democratic transitions. On the other hand, you also have this some informal student groups like Forgot that kept their pressure to form the new transition government to replace Habibie. But unfortunately, the pressure from them was not as strong as when the students demanded Suharto's resignations due to the fragmentation of their numbers, because they were already had different agenda at this point. And to reflect from the decisions from the special sessions, I think the winner at this point of time was the gradualist approach, because the sessions, I think if you see it from my paper, I think they tried to to align their political decisions and adopted some of the demands, especially voiced by the Ciganjur declarations. I think this is when the result from the long, a strong state repression and also fragmentation among the students, the result was the preemption path, because as you know, they decided to hold the elections in 1999. And I think election as an arena to enter or seize the states, it was like the only options to get into the states. So the fate of the students was locked in these general elections. And I think there were some parties that were based on the student movements, or like a PRD and also PKS. But as you know, it's not possible to compete in the general elections by only relying on the mass of the students, because their numbers are so limited. No path for students. The path was closed by the democratic procedure to enter and seize the states, but some of their demands were realized in the short term during the special sessions, especially for those demands coming from the students who supported more the gradualist approach. So what I want to conclude with some notes here. So I think we need to pay more attention on how the state repressions molded not only opposition groups, but also the possibility of success of student movements. And I think if you want to see or analyze student movements, I think you also need to see to whom actually they relate with. You don't want to see students as solely single political actors, but you also want to see how they relate with other political actors and under what kind of state repression actually their relation is forged. I also want to say, I think we need to pay more attention here to how actually the normal time fragmentations, like during the student senate elections, is actually linked with the fragmentation under crisis, and how is it actually amplified during this crisis time. Thank you so much. That's my presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fajar. And we are seeing much applause from everybody around the room. And at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. If you are able to find your raise your hand function, go ahead and raise it. I see Jonathan raised his hand. We'll take a few questions, and then we'll come back and let Fajar respond. Let's start with Jonathan. Go ahead, Jonathan. Your mic is live.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. First, Fajar, congratulations on completing your degree. It's a great achievement, and we look forward to many years of productive scholarship from you in the years to come. I have really a simple question, I suppose, that comes more from, I guess, my experience or knowledge of the US student movement than the Indonesian student movement. But I think much of the writing about the US student movement sort of says, well, why would we expect students to have any political power? They don't have many political resources. They don't have much money. They don't have weapons. They don't, if they take a nonviolent stance, they don't have really organic linkages to larger voting blocs or political actors. For example, religious groups or union leaders have much more organic relationships with larger masses of people that could be mobilized. So, you know, we often ask the question, well, why would we expect students to have much in the way of political power or the ability to affect longer-term political change? I mean, we understand their ability just because of their position as young people to raise issues, but why would we expect them to be politically effective? They're just not really many of them. And, you know, David Runciman, the British political scientist, always says, well, if your political movement is depending on young people, you're doomed to failure, for the simple reason that there aren't very many of them compared to older people. They're a fairly small group of people from between the ages of, say, 18 and 25. So I just wanted to get your sense of why in Indonesia in particular do we have any expectation that students should have more political effectiveness than they have in the past?
Okay, that's the first question. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Mustafa Fakhri, otherwise known as Tope, has raised his hand. Beth, can we open up to him? And Tope is the former chairman of the board of directors of ISRSF. Tope, go ahead with your question for Fajar.
Okay, thank you very much. An excellent presentation, Fajar.
There we go. Louder, Tope. Can we hear you more loudly, please?
Okay. Congratulations, Fajar, for the degree. It's an excellent presentation, I think. I didn't get your opinion about the IME movement, International Mahasiswa Islam. So, how can you draw the role of IME at the time? I think that's all.
Did you say the role of HME?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So specifically then in 98, 99, was there a particular role for HME? Is the core of the question. Okay. Any other questions lined up for Fajar? Bonnie, let's, Beth, can we open up the microphone for Bonnie Hargens? Go ahead, Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Jeffrey. Yeah, Fajar, congratulations for completion of your study. And I truly appreciate what you have done, recalling the historical facts of the student movements in Indonesia. I've got a very simple question. What is actually the implication of your study for the social change in Indonesia? I mean that for the future of the student movement in contemporary Indonesia. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's first round of questions. Fajar, your responses in any particular order that you wish.
Yes, thank you so much for the questions. I think they are like a really great questions. First, I think I want to respond to Jonathan's points. So why do you have to expect like student movement to have this certain kind of power? I think there's this historical context actually play here because at least in the countries like Guatemala, Iran, and also Indonesia, these are like the post-colonial countries, right? And during the post-colonial countries, I think you had this kind of pattern that actually students, they were like educated by the colonial educations, and somehow the states and also the regimes, they put like so much like a myth and also hopes, also because their political positions as bureaucrats, the leaders of the nationalist movements. So do you have this kind of like a discourse that has been existing from the past that students actually can make change. And it was like a proven throughout time that actually they had like a very important roles during the regime transitions. But for the case of Indonesia, at least if you consider like the degree of state repression in the past toward opposition groups, and also how actually opposition groups develop themselves, I think I will say that I don't think you can expect much from students beyond their like a traditional role as the initiator of change. And to flip the side, I think if you are like in the opposition groups, to have this kind of concentration of intellectuals, educated intellectuals who have like free time to discuss things about politics and everything. I think for opposition groups, you really want to use them as a like a political force to make a break for the first time, to initiate like a change. But after that, I think you know to what extent that their limit is. And I think it very much depends on what are like the interests of opposition groups. What do they want with the students after they manage to achieve like a certain kind of change? So I think that's my response to Jonathan. The second thing on the HME, I think based on my interviews, it's not that like a HME didn't like play an important role, because some of the, for instance, in some campuses like UI, I think some of the student activists, they were like members of HME, and I think they decided not to use their identity as HME students. They choose to join groups like KBUI, the Keluarga Besar Universitas Indonesia, the informal student group of UI at UI, and I think they just decided not to use their HME identity. But the role of HME, I think, became more important when Habibie rose to power. Because if you see like the news and also the archives after the fall of Suharto, I think they were like kind of like a more active to support Habibie and to support the gradualist path toward like democratic regimes. At least that's what I can say about like the roles of HME during the regime transitions in 1998. For Bonnie's questions on, so what are like the social impacts on students during the contemporary Indonesia? I myself, I'm not researching on student movement during this contemporary period, but what I want to propose is if we want to assess like the impact of student movements during the contemporary period, I think you still need to pay attention on to whom actually the students relate to. And also, I think you also want to see actually to what extent actually the degree of state repressions during the current democratic regimes is compared to what happened during the New Order, and what are like the impacts of this state repression toward the development of opposition groups, and how they assist actually student movements in the contemporary era. I mean, I cannot say what are like their impacts in the current situations, but I can only offer like that kind of framework to analyze student movements in the contemporary era. Thank you. Your mic.
Yes, got it. Thank you. All right. Anyone else would like to? Okay, we have one hand raised from Rido. Any others? Also from Nika. Any other hands raised? Let me look on the second screen. All right. We'll take those two questions. Let's start with Rido, and then we will go directly to Nika. Go ahead, Rido.
Thanks, Jeff, for the opportunity. First of all, congratulations, Fajar, for the completion. It's really great achievement for you. And I'm just curious about one of the faction in the student movement, like the Islamists, particularly the Tarbiyah one, that then transformed into the PK and also PKS. I'm just curious how they able to sustain their movement from the student movement and then transform into the so-called political movement. In your analysis, what makes them capable to do that? Because if I'm not mistaken, they also experience persecution during the New Order, particularly the Tarbiyah movement is one of the victim in Suharto's repression. But then also they are also not part of this so-called camp of the Ciganjur, right? So if we survive, should have relationship with this gradualist elite. So I'm just curious what makes them sustain and even influential in the process of the transition. That's only my question. Thank you.
And over to Nika.
Actually, the one who wants to ask the question is not me, but Bramantya, my husband. So.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, Bang Fajar, thank you for your presentation. Congratulations for your study. I think it's really a significant study on Reformasi era, because many of the other study only focus on the student movement as a unitary actor, but I think it's well described on the fragmentation and dynamics in the student movement. I want to ask you about many of your informants is from Jakarta mostly. Do you think it's also implying that that the students group in Jakarta is obviously the most influential group in 98 movement? And second, the force of change in Reformasi is, as you mentioned, is highly fragmented. There's dynamics, different actors, etc. And yet they managed to topple down Suharto as as their minimum demand. Do you think how you measure the degree of influence of students in these transitions? And the third question is, do you also compare this dynamics and fragmentation in the student movement in Reformasi era with the 66 student movement, where they got this strong support from the military, or the recent student movement in Reformasi di Korupsi era? Thank you.
Okay, Fajar, your responses, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions. They're like a really great questions. So the first one was from Rido, how to sustain and transform. Actually, this very group, Islamist group of the students, especially from the Jamaah Tarbiyah, into like a political movement. I think going back to the 1980s, it is true that the Islamist groups, I think they were also repressed by the regime, right? But I don't think the degree of the repression can match to what happened in the 1965. I mean, even though they experienced like a repressions, I think they still have this their networks and also organizational capacity to exist throughout 1980s and 1990s. And I think that explained, although a little bit late, that explained the capacity of the Islamist students to dominate actually student senates, especially in public universities, like in UI and IKIP Jakarta. Like for instance, in UI, I think from my interview, I think the students affiliated to Jamaah Tarbiyah, they could like dominate the student senates from 1994 until 1998. And I think it even continued until, I don't know, I graduated from UI from 2007. And I think the head of the student senate back then was still from this group. So you can maintain this kind of domination because I think the state repression in the past was not so strong with these Islamic students towards the Jamaah Tarbiyah. And I think if you see it from other like public universities like in IKIP Jakarta, they also could dominate the student senate. Even they could make like this like a breakthrough in campuses like IAIN Syarif Hidayatullah, in which the traditional power was on the hand of student organizations like HMI and PMI. I mean, after the Reformasi, because of their links and networks, they could like penetrate the defense of these two traditional forces at the IAIN. And how did they transform into like a political movement as a political party? I think it's very clear from the beginning when they established this Jamaah Tarbiyah movement. They already had this inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who already like couple of times tried to penetrate the Egyptian state. And I think they just followed this strategy. And I think it was like a very clear from the beginning that, oh, we want to actually seize the state in the end. That's like the goal of our movement. About their contribution to the gradualist approach, I think I got like an interesting insight from one of the student activists from the Jamaah Tarbiyah, and he said to me that after the fall of Suharto, I think what he did to his friends. Also, this guy had like a very important position in the organization as like a secretary general, And what he did is he encouraged all of his fellows to read Sam Huntington's The Third Wave, which is like a tells us how to actually move into like a democratic regimes. And it was like mostly on following the path of the gradualist path. I think that's my response to Rido. To Bram, yes, I think, I mean, I didn't have the chance to research student movements in other places, I mean, other cities. But I think Jakarta is important as like reflected by one of my informants. I think he said something like, Indonesian student movement, it's always started in Yogyakarta and ends in Jakarta. And maybe after that, it has like a ripples in other cities. And Jakarta is, I think, important because also it is the place, at least during that time, where all these like important political decisions was taken during back then. But I'm very much interested to see how actually the fragmentation also occurred in other cities, because according to one of my informants, the dynamics could be different, because in some other cities, Islamic students, they were like the driver of the protests during the regime transitions. I think you also mentioned something like how does it actually compare to the student movement in 1966 compared to what happened in 1998? Maybe this is not like a popular opinion, but I think they were like a more successful based on the indicator of how they actually could seize like a political positions inside the states. They could make like a very strong alliance with the military, and I think that alliance really helped them to enter the state and, of course, materialize some of their agenda, whether we like it or not. Their agenda is. I think what I want to say is it is important to have an agenda, I mean, for students, but without power, especially power inside the state, I don't think you can push it like a further. I think that's my response.
Okay. We have one follow-up question or comment from Tope again. Go ahead, Mustafa.
Thank you, Jeff. Fajar, I guess what you wrote about him is so completed. I just want to add some information about the HME at the time. As an organization, perhaps I agree with you that there seems not to take a position, whether to the right or to the left movement. But in the POC branch, I think they have kind of agreement that between the activists that they took the middle path. They took the middle path, so not to the right or to the left, and they take the intellectual movement using the CAS-M, the study group. And as an organization, maybe in the central board, there's no position at the time, but as an individual activists, they made a significant role, I think. The first
the first person who declared that Soto have to step down was from the Army activists. It is the Asep Fajar. Oh, sorry, not the Asep, the Asep. Is former Secretary General of ISMAHI, Ikatan Senat Mahasiswa Hukum se-Indonesia. He declared that Soto have to step down that in 1997, I think. So he is the first person who declared and to fight against Soto. And after that, and after the power shift to Habibie, then Central Board of AMI made a statement that they behind the Habibie. I think that's all.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tope, for that addition. All right. You want to make a comment? Go ahead, Fajar.
No, I really appreciate the information because I did not capture that kind of information. Thank you.
Okay. Well, fortunately, Tope is somebody you can contact quite easily, and he can perhaps fill you in on get some additional sources and information for you. That would be great.
Yes,
part of our wonderful network of people, many of whom are represented here. All right. At this point, I would like to offer applause to Fajar for his presentation. Thank you very, very much. With that, we conclude our presentations. We only have one last bit of this session this morning and tonight, and that is we have a ceremony always at the end of our Arryman Symposiums. We usually have 2 symposia, as you know, and we do things slightly different at each of them, but we're just going to combine it together here today. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the spotlight back on Amrina again. Yay! And Amrina, we have 2 very important things with regard to you. One is your certificate, the presentation of your certificate for the completion of the Arryman Fellow Year. And I don't know if it's up on your screen. There we are. I can see it now. Okay. I'm going to put on my old man's glasses and read this dedication to you. So, 2019 Arryman Fellow, Amrina Rosyada, the Equality, Development, and Globalization Studies program at the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs recognizes your successful completion of the Arryman Fellows program, and it is signed by Annelies Riles, myself, Mary Weissmantel, the chair of anthropology, and Milan Mersic, who is the vice president for research. And so congratulations, Amrina, on the wonderful, successful completion. Yay. Applause.
Thank you
applause.
very much.
And then we have a second announcement regarding Amrina, which is that the ISRSF board considered a motion to promote you from Arryman Fellow to Arryman Scholar, and that motion was carried unanimously by the board. And so you are officially promoted to Arryman Scholar, which gives you a 6-year fellowship for a scholarship to complete your doctoral thesis in the Department of Anthropology. Yay! And of course, you've already been admitted to the Department of Anthropology. And so we are extremely excited for your future in the program. And so that is our announcement regarding Amrina. Everybody, applause for Amrina. Yay!
Thank you very much.
So we can say last, but certainly not least in the program. And so welcome officially to the Arryman Scholars group. And now one more quick announcement, which is that both Luthfi and Fajar, having defended their theses, are now also officially made postdocs. And so they are both receiving postdoc fellowships. The postdocs will be at the Institute for Advanced Research at Gajah Mada University. And these postdocs are jointly sponsored by both Gajah Mada University and by ISRSF. And there'll be a number of things they'll be doing during their postdocs, but one of the most important is to take the manuscripts which they have now produced as their doctoral theses and rework and revise those manuscripts into books for publication. And so we are very excited that these two new doctors, Dr. Luthfi Adam and Dr. Muhammad Fajar, are going to move on to become postdocs in the program. And so congratulations to both of you. Yay, applause, applause. I guess we do like the Occupy movement where we do our hands like this, you know, which means silent applause. Okay. All right, and then last but not least, we're ready to wrap up, but I want to say a special word of thanks to Beth Morrissey for putting this symposium together. Thank you very much, Beth. This has really worked out great. Of course, we would all like to be together, but at least we get to meet this way. Thank you to you for making this happen. I also would be remiss if I do not say a word of thanks to the ISRSF and EDGE's benefactors and donors who have made this program of education possible. So thank you to you. I also want to say a word of thanks to the Northwestern University departments, political science, sociology, history, and anthropology, who have made such a welcoming and highly educational home for the people participating in this program. Thank you to the professors. Thank you to the fellow PhD students who are so supportive. And thank you also to the Arryman students who are so supportive of each other, as we've seen today. And then finally, a last word of thanks is to all the rest of you who joined us today to make this Arryman Symposium a great success. We look forward to much more in the future. And the next Arryman Symposium is going to be at IFAR, the Institute for Advanced Research at Gajah Mada University, but it will be Zoom televised from there so that everyone, both back in back at Northwestern, can also participate. So with that, a final word of thanks and congratulations to all three of our speakers today. And goodbye to everyone. Ta-da. Bye-bye.